This is TWiT.
All right, this week Apple joined Amazon, Netflix in the realm of being an entertainment provider on their own with Apple original programming on the new Apple TV Plus service, which debuted November 1st. Free if you've bought a qualifying Apple hardware product in the last couple of months, and for a year, and $4.99 a month for everyone else. Launching, okay, I'm going to say it. This is whoever is the marketing genius who came up with this one. They get a cookie. Apple is boasting that this service is the world's first originals-only streaming service. What that means is they didn't buy any catalog content. There's nothing back
derivative
catalog
here, Chase.
There's no sitcoms or
no repeats
or detective shows from the 70s or anything that you've seen before. It's only a handful of shows that were made specifically for Apple TV Plus. And there is an argument to be made that with such a limited supply of programming, it's kind of hard for Apple to make the case that this service is worth buying. Then again, if you bought any Apple hardware in the last couple of months, guess what? You can get it for a year for free instead of having to pay $4.99 a month. So the service is out. The shows are out. They're not doing a weekly release or a binge drop. They're doing a hybrid where they've released, I think, 3 episodes of a lot of shows. Some things they've dropped a whole season, but they are going to do weekly releases of their top-line shows from this point. So rather than doing the Netflix thing, quite honestly, they don't have enough shows, right? They would drop them all and then they would go away for several months and nothing would happen on the service. So instead, they're doing weekly releases after, in the case of things like C and The Morning Show and For All Mankind, dropping 3 episodes on day 1. So we can talk about this from a strategy perspective. If you've seen the shows, we could talk about whether the shows are any good or not. I'm going to bet that they're better than Planet of the Apps. But beyond that, I don't know. Dan, what have you seen of Apple TV Plus?
I've watched the first 3 episodes of The Morning Show, and that's so far, that's it. As far as the originals thing go, it did remind me of, I think it was maybe in the late 90s or early 2000s, NBC had a slogan that they would run sometimes when there were reruns. If you haven't seen it, it's new to you. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was such a brilliant tautology of like, well, of course, like if you haven't seen it, it's new. And in the same case, I feel like that's sort of what Apple's spinning here. I've actually liked The Morning Show. I know that it's received kind of mixed reviews. It's something that kind of appeals to me, and I feel like it reflects certainly that they put a lot of money into the show. It looks good. It's got really top talent, even down to like the supporting cast, or like there's a lot of faces that you recognize. Is it the kind of thing that's necessarily going to go out and win, say, an Emmy? I don't think so. I don't think that it will. But I think it's a solid effort, and it's enjoyable enough that when I finished the first episode, I kept watching. And if there had been more, I probably would have kept watching them by now. So, to some extent, that's all that really matters. And from a larger business question, there is a question of what success looks like for Apple here. Obviously, if you're giving away your service for a whole year to most of, at least your most devoted customers, probably the people most likely to pay for the service, then obviously you're not pulling in a lot of revenue that's purely based on the content that you've spent millions and millions of dollars, if not, I believe it's billions of dollars on. Yes. So you spend a lot of money. That's a lot of investment to recoup. And it's not something that you're necessarily pulling in a lot of subscription money from on day 1 or even on day 365. So I think this is a larger play from Apple, and this is still sort of them planting their flag in the sand here. Say like, hey, we've got this as an option. This is a competition to Amazon. It's part of our whole package that we are sort of offering to people who use the Apple ecosystem, and it's going to be good stuff. I mean, like I think there's nothing so far that I've heard is absolute trash. I know there's some stuff that has gotten worse reviews than others, but I think they've realized, and to a certain extent, in order to exist as this mega tech company in this day and age, that original content, for whatever reason, is a part of that equation. So I'm curious to see how they end up justifying sort of like, does it bring in people to buy other devices or subscribe to other services? What is the end of the day value proposition for this? Or is it just something that we feel like it's an investment in the longer term ecosystem, and it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how much money we're going to make out of it?
Right, because it's billions of dollars that they're spending on this content. Billions of dollars. Renee, this was available in Canada, among many, many other countries. That's one of the things that's unique, I think, in this launch, is that Apple built it for international, and so it's not going to. We're going to talk about what AT&T is doing with HBO Max, which is a U.S. only service essentially. But you got to see the stuff in Canada, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are services that have fairly good, like Netflix has built out fairly good international representation, but because it is so, like, the licensing model is so fragmented and it's filled with these little different fiefdoms, you don't have the same catalogs globally, and it's incredibly frustrating. I'll go to watch I subscribe to CBS All Access, and I'll go to watch a show and I'll hit the button and it'll bounce me into one of my local cable apps because they have the rights in Canada, and then they want me to put in a cable subscription, which I don't have, and so I can't watch the thing that's part of the service that I'm already paying to watch, and it's endlessly frustrating. But because it's originals only, Apple owns all the rights to them, and they can put them in hundreds of 100+ countries right away, and I think that's great. And I think in general, if Apple decided they had to do it, this was probably the best way for them to do it. It's a very Apple way to do it. It's like, if we have these billions of dollars, we want to help tell great stories. Let's go out and let's just tell the best stories. Like, we don't make 4 phones a year the way OnePlus does. We have our shot of phones all at one time. They're just making a few series all at once, and they're going to be top-notch series. I mean, the morning show isn't the newsroom, and C is not Game of Thrones by any means. They started off with good ingredients that weren't stirred very well. They got better over the episodes. And to Dan's point, like, I would have just kept watching the morning show if all the episodes had been available, and I would have just kept watching, see if all the episodes had been there. And I get why they're not, because there's a free week trial, and you could probably get through all of the content and then cancel immediately if you did that. But it's good enough, and it's getting better with the opening salvo that I'm curious to see. And I don't know if they necessarily have to make a lot of money here. I think they just have to get their platform going and then use it to, again, increase the value of the overall Apple ecosystem for people.
Devendra, what do you think? I know you care about TV and film. What do you think about what Apple's doing here?
I do, and I've been following this closely, and I was really excited to see, like, what would Apple do differently. And it turns out kind of nothing. Like, my review title is Apple TV Plus is fine, and it is. Like, none of the shows are terrible. They're all perfectly watchable in certain ways, but yeah, the morning hour feels like the newsroom, and it feels a lot like Aaron Sorkin without Aaron Sorkin, as I think the New York Times review had said. A lot of all these shows in many ways feel like things we've seen before, and it seems like, at least right now, Apple is taking kind of the Netflix approach to some of their content, where it's like, well, this is okay. I guess I'll watch this because it's on a service. To what Dan was saying, I think this is the opening salvo, and I feel like launching this thing in 100 countries, that's pretty impressive, because Disney Plus is only, I think, going to be available in a couple once it launches in November or later this month. Yeah. So the scale of what Apple did is impressive, showing that they could produce a streaming platform. I mean, we knew they could deliver the stuff because of iTunes, and people have been buying that stuff for a while, but showing that they could produce original content, it's more like they prove that they can do it. I'm interested to see where they go from here, especially like that M. Night Shyamalan show coming up soon. They talked about some content coming into next year too. Nothing seems incredible. Nothing seems like, oh man, I really have to subscribe to this. It does seem like, oh, this is a nice benefit because I'm an Apple customer, because I just bought an iPhone or an iPad or something. I don't think they're doing this for subscription money at all, and that's why it costs $5 for sure.
Yeah, I wonder about...
It's tough too.
Go ahead, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say it's tough too, because they've also not done the thing that a lot of the other competitors have done, where it's like, let's license large existing IP or own existing IP, right? Disney gets to roll out all its Marvel and Star Wars shows, and that's a huge way to bring people in. And, Netflix obviously had its Marvel shows back in the day and got to use that to sort of bolster its original, like, early on. I don't see Apple deciding it wants to play in that pool, certainly not from corporate partners that are that large. It seems to be a very Apple way of focusing on let's kind of do this ourselves, stem to stern. And I think that presents potential challenges for them. And in terms of them building up their repertoire, I think it's still possible that, a show that comes out next year from them could pick up enough buzz to be the show that drives people to the network, right? The water cooler show. I think that's kind of what they're in search of. Is there not necessarily Game of Thrones in genre, but Game of Thrones, i.e. the show everyone is talking about when it goes on every week? That is what they would like. I just don't think they've necessarily figured out what show that is yet.
It does feel a little bit like these shows were created in a lab.
Oh, yeah.
They're trying to find that. They're trying to strike gold. And I get that, but I wonder if you're actually never going to do that if you're trying for the big hit. What you need to do is find some people who are on the verge of superstardom as a writer, as an actor, and they have a great idea, and it's going to bubble beneath the surface, and there are not going to be 1,000 stories in the Hollywood Reporter about it, but it will be the thing that ends up breaking through. Just like with Game of Thrones, other than people who had read those books, nobody knew anything about it, and the showrunners had never done anything before, and it became the biggest TV show ever. These all feel like, let's go to Reese Witherspoon and Jennifer Aniston and craft something like The Newsroom, or let's spend a lot of money on a high concept thing, kind of like Game of Thrones, and it gives you C, and we'll put Jason Momoa in it, and okay, great, but they're coming out of the lab. Are they really going to be able to just look? If you could make Game of Thrones in the lab, there would be 100 Game of Throneses, and there's only one. And For All Mankind, as much as I like that, it is. Let's get Ron Moore to do a space show because we liked Battlestar Galactica, and it's a little bit different, but it's like that. Renee, you were saying.
Mm-hmm. No, I was agreeing with you completely. And I think also they managed to get the big stars by, in some ways, greenlighting the vanity projects from their own production companies instead of growing them inside Apple. I mean, it's a good mix of both. And the risk is that not all these vanity projects or these big stars are going to give you the quality of show that you get from a writer-producer like Aaron Sorkin, or you get from lighting fire to the entire world with Game of Thrones.
What Apple hasn't done is make a giant deal with a creator like what you've seen elsewhere. J.J. Abrams, several other creators that Shonda Rhimes, Ryan Murphy, right? All of these where they're like, you have established hits and now we're going to give you a lot of money. And again, the question is, are you going to get a new established hit from that, or would you be better off spending all that money on a bunch of people who are up and comers? And Apple, I think maybe has just been outbid on those. I'm not sure that's a strategy because they bid on those
Abrams
people.
Famously, I think there was a report that Abrams turned them down even though their bid was higher than other places where he went to. So I'm really interested in like Apple's creative approach to like what were they telling him in terms of like what stories you could tell or what restrictions were they going to put on it? Yeah,
and that was a huge.
Their bid was double. Warner's.
That was he was a little worried about the film.
He didn't want to be locked in. They wanted him doing Apple products, Apple projects only, and he was like, no, I want to do my own stuff too.
And I will say one of the big narratives coming into this launch was Apple, Tim Cook is giving notes. Tim Cook is saying you shouldn't really put things on these shows that we can't show in an Apple store. The most cutting phrase that came up in the entire discussion was that what Apple wanted to do was make expensive NBC shows, which is a real burn, let me tell you. And I got to say, I think that a lot of that came from people who got fired off of shows or were disgruntled in some way. Yes. If you look at the material that's out there, there is no shortage of edgy material in the Apple TV shows. The three main dramas are all TVMA. No, it's not. It's not family friendly stuff entirely.
I would say 5 or 10 years ago, before we had this like surfeit of content from all of these different services, I think any one of these might have been a show that really caught people's attention. But the problem is that the bar is so high.
Yeah, we're in the platinum age now, right?
The peak TV, right? There is so much stuff that making something stand out really requires it be amazing. And I think all of the shows sound like they are good, solid shows. And not every show has or could be the greatest show of all time. But I think that just because the competition is so fierce nowadays and people are dealing with essentially a lack of time, right? There's only so much TV you can watch, especially if you need your time to read Twitter or whatever that you're doing with the rest of your time.
That's very important.
That like you're fighting for eyeballs a lot. And I think that means you really got to bring your A game. And I think this is B game. It's not bad, but it's not necessarily the thing that's going to win people over to your service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is brutal, right? I mean, Devindra, it's brutal right now. The amount of content we've got and the quality of the content that we've got. I think everybody would probably agree the money being spent on TV right now is not sustainable. It's everybody spending huge amounts of money on huge amounts of content. It's going to be more than 500 original scripted programs in the U.S. this year. It was that way last year too. It's not sustainable, but it's a gold rush right now. And Apple can be part of the gold rush, but it makes it that much harder for them to break through.